Hey, Sarah Jo here. In this tutorial, I'm going to walk you through how to sew a neckline binding. If you look through the sweatshirts you have at home, I guarantee they're almost all finished differently. After loads of research on sweatshirts, this is by far my favorite way to finish a neckband, and it's the cleanest way in my opinion. Let's get started.
To begin, ensure the zipper is unzipped and the zipper tape is lying flat, not folded back to the wrong side. Pin the right sides of the collar pieces together along the top edge. Sew the collar pieces along the top edge only, using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, or whatever seam allowance your pattern calls for. Backstitch at the beginning and at the end. Stop sewing once you reach the other side of the neckline. If you're using double fold bias tape, ensure the folded side is towards the top of your garment. Align the folded edge with your neckline seam, with the zipper seam allowance still flipped towards the center of the garment. Pin the binding in place between the 2 layers of the collar. Make sure the binding isn't twisted and repeat this on the other side. Align the top folded edge with the neckline seam and pin in place between the collar layers. If you're using foldover elastic, fold the elastic in half along the fold line so that the wrong sides are together. Pin in between the collar layers with the fold pointed towards the top of the garment. Make sure the fold aligns with the neckline seam. I'll be using double fold bias tape for the rest of this tutorial, but the process is the same for foldover elastic. Sew along the short side of the collar, encasing the upper edge of the zipper and securing the binding. Repeat this on both sides. You can see the bias tape is pinned between the collar layers over the zipper. Start sewing at the top edge of the collar and sew towards the bottom of the collar. Backstitch at the beginning and end. You can see the binding is securely stitched between the collar layers. Repeat on the other side. Clip the corners of the collar, being careful not to cut through the seams. Turn the collar right side out. Pull the bias tape inside the neckline. When you zip the zipper, it will have a clean appearance on the outside of the garment. Press the top collar seam so the wrong sides of the collar are together. This will ensure a smooth top edge. Turn the sweatshirt wrong side out. Keep the bias tape out of the way and pin both collar layers together at the seam allowance. You are just pinning the inner collar edge to the seam allowance, not to the sweatshirt. Sew completely around the neckline, getting as close as you can to the zipper. Set your machine to a basting stitch. This just means to lengthen your stitch length. If you have questions about this, I have a more in-depth video on basting stitches in the caption. Start sewing as close to the zipper as you can. You won't be able to start right at the edge, but get it as close as you can. You can see the side with the outer collar and yoke seam already sewn is facing up. Follow along that stitching line while you sew. Continue sewing around the collar, stopping when you get close to the edge of the zipper. You won't be able to make it all the way to the edge. See here how you only sewed the inner collar to the seam allowance. This basting stitch will act as a guide when attaching the bias tape to the neckline. Pin the bias tape to the seam allowance. The top folded edge will align with the basting stitch you just sewed. You are only pinning this to the seam allowance, not to the sweatshirt itself. Continue pinning the bias tape in place around the entire neckline. Again, the top folded edge of the bias tape will align with that basting stitch. Change your machine back to the regular stitch length and stitch the bias tape to the seam allowance only. Sew along the top folded edge of the bias tape, again, only stitching it to the seam allowance. Ensure the folded edge of the bias tape is aligned with the basting stitch. Start sewing as close to the zipper as possible. Again, you won't be able to start right on the edge, but you will be able to get close. Backstitch at the beginning and end and sew the bias tape all the way around the neckline. Backstitch at the end, getting as close to the zipper as possible. You can see the bias tape is just sewn to the seam allowance. You can't see the stitching on the right side of the garment. If the basting stitch is showing after the bias tape is attached, remove the basting stitch. Be careful not to remove the stitches you just sewed. Next, trim the seam allowance under the bias tape. Ensure you don't cut the outermost layer of the bias tape. Once the seam allowance is trimmed, the bias tape will fold over to completely cover the raw edges of the seam allowance. Pin the bias tape around the entire neckline. This time, you'll be pinning the bias tape to the yoke of the garment. The seam allowance will be completely encased, and this will give you a clean finish on the neckline. Continue pinning around the entire collar. You can see here that it's pinned to the yoke. To finish the neckline, you'll sew around the lower edge of the bias tape. This will encase the raw edge and give you a clean finish around the neckline. The stitching will show on the right side of the garment, so choose a matching bobbin color. Start sewing at the very edge of the zipper, backstitching at the beginning and at the end. Sew all the way around the collar. You can see you'll be able to get all the way to the edge of the zipper. Backstitch at the end. You can see here how clean and professional the inside neckline looks. You can also see the stitching on the right side of the sweatshirt. Turn the sweatshirt right side out. To finish the collar, top stitch around the zipper and the collar. Start sewing at the lower edge of the front yoke, sewing about 1/4 inch away from the zipper. Backstitch at the beginning and at the end. When you get to the top of the zipper, you may need to stop sewing, keep your needle down in the fabric, and unzip the zipper so you can continue to sew in a straight line. Continue sewing, pivoting around the corners. If you need extra guidance on sewing around corners, check out my Sewing Corners tutorial in the caption. When you reach the other side of the zipper, put the needle down, lift the presser foot, and pivot the fabric. Continue sewing along the edge of the zipper until you reach the bottom of the yoke. Backstitch at the end. And that's how you sew a professional neckline binding with a zipper placket. Happy sewing!